Ethan Carter slammed the plate into the sink so hard it cracked straight down the middle. His 14-year-old daughter hadn't touched her dinner. Again, third night in a row. "I'm not hungry," she said, and walked away without looking at him. He stood there, hands gripping the counter, jaw tight, staring at a meal he'd paid someone to cook, and nobody wanted to eat. That was the night he made the call. And the woman, who showed up the next morning carrying a worn suitcase and a recipe notebook older than his marriage, was the last person he expected to break him. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, subscribe. You won't want to miss where this goes. The morning Clara Bennett arrived, it was still dark enough that the porch light hadn't switched off. She stood on the front steps of Ethan Carter's property at 6:47 a.m., her old canvas suitcase beside her feet, a cloth bag slung over one shoulder, and a notebook tucked under her arm, like she was protecting it from the cold. She wore a dark green jacket that had seen better decades, and her hair was pulled back neatly, but a few strands had already worked themselves loose in the October wind. She didn't knock twice. She knocked once, firm and steady, and then she waited. Inside, Ethan was already awake. He was always already awake. Sleep had stopped being a real option around the same time everything else stopped feeling real, sometime in the year after the funeral. After the casseroles from neighbors ran out, after people stopped calling to check on him and started assuming he was fine because he kept showing up to work. He heard the knock and checked his watch. 6:47. He'd told the agency 7 o'clock. He wasn't sure whether to be annoyed or relieved that she was early. He opened the door. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Clara Bennett was a full-figured white woman, somewhere in her mid-40s, broad-shouldered, with warm brown eyes, and the kind of face that didn't try to hide anything. She looked tired, not the temporary tired that a good night's sleep fixes, but the kind that comes from years of carrying something heavy without ever setting it down. He recognized it because he saw the same thing every morning in his own mirror. She looked at him directly, not boldly, not challenging, just clearly, like she wasn't going to pretend she didn't see him. "Mr. Carter," she said. "I'm Clara Bennett. I'm a few minutes early. I can wait in the car if you'd prefer." He stepped back from the door. "No," he said. "Come in." The agency had sent him 4 candidates over the past 3 weeks. The first one had taken one look at the size of the kitchen and said she'd need an assistant. The second had asked within 20 minutes whether there was a separate living quarters, a private suite. She'd emphasized, with her own entrance. The third had seemed perfect until she'd made an offhand comment about the house feeling sad, and Ethan had ended the interview on the spot, with a handshake and a check for her gas. The fourth, a woman named Patricia, had lasted 6 days, before quietly letting the agency know that working for Ethan Carter was, in her words, not worth any amount of money. He hadn't asked for specifics. He'd simply called the agency again and said, flatly, "Send me someone who needs the job." He hadn't meant it to sound harsh. He'd meant it practically. He needed someone who would show up. Someone who wasn't going to walk away the first time he forgot to say good morning, or the first time his daughter slammed a door, or the first time the house went so quiet it felt like something living had left it. Clara Bennett had 2 references, one from a family in Roanoke who'd relocated overseas, and one from a widower in Charlotte who'd written, in slightly shaky handwriting, "She kept my house, yes, but more than that, she kept me from falling apart. I don't know how to thank her for that." Ethan had read that letter 3 times. He hadn't told anyone he'd read it 3 times. He showed her through the house the way he showed everyone through the house, efficiently, without sentiment, pointing out the utility room, the pantry, the schedule he'd already printed and laminated for the refrigerator door. "Breakfast is at 7:15, he said, walking ahead of her through the hallway. "My daughter, Sophie, she's 14. She'll tell you she doesn't eat breakfast. She does, she just doesn't know it yet." He paused. "She likes blueberries. Put blueberries in something and she'll eat it." Clara was writing in a small spiral notebook she'd pulled from her jacket pocket. Not the old cloth notebook, a different one. A practical one. "Any allergies?" she asked. "No. Any foods she won't eat on principle. Not allergy, just refusal." He thought about it. "Mushrooms. She says they have the texture of regret." Her words. Clara wrote something down. He couldn't tell if she was trying not to smile, or if she just had a still face. "And you, Mr. Carter? Anything I should know?" "I eat whatever's in front of me." She looked up from the notebook. That's not really an answer. He stopped walking. It had been a long time since someone had pushed back on something he said. Not combatively, just honestly. "I skip breakfast," he said, after a moment. "I don't mean to, I just forget." She wrote that down too. The kitchen was the last room on the tour. Ethan pushed the door open and stood back to let her in first. And he watched her the way he'd learned to watch people carefully, without making it obvious. He'd learned a long time ago that you could tell more about a person in the first 30 seconds they spent in a room than in the first 30 minutes they spent talking. Clara walked into the kitchen and stopped. She didn't pull out her notebook. She didn't open cabinets or check the refrigerator or ask about the appliances. She just stood there for a moment, in the center of the room, and looked around. Then she looked at him. "This is a good kitchen," she said. And the way she said it quiet, almost careful, made it sound less like a compliment and more like a diagnosis. "It functions," he said. "I'm sure it does." She turned to the window over the sink. Morning light was just starting to come through. When was the last time someone cooked a real meal in here? Not reheated. Not ordered. Cooked. The question landed differently than he'd expected. "I don't see how that's relevant," he said. "It probably isn't," she agreed pleasantly, and opened the pantry door to take inventory. Sophie came downstairs at 7:09. She was 14 years old, with her father's dark hair and her mother's eyes, a detail that still knocked the breath out of Ethan sometimes when the light was right. She was dressed for school, backpack already on, earbuds in one ear, the way teenagers wore them when they wanted to signal that any conversation would be tolerated only briefly. She stopped when she saw Clara. "Who are you?" she asked. Not rudely exactly, but not warmly either. Clara was at the stove. She turned around, with a dish towel over her shoulder, like she'd always been there. "Clara," she said, "I'm going to be helping around the house. You must be Sophie." Sophie looked at her father. Ethan looked back at her steadily. "Don't," said the look. Sophie pulled her second earbud out. "Are you the cook?" "Among other things. The last cook put mushrooms in the eggs." Sophie said this like she was filing a formal complaint. "I heard about the mushrooms," Clara said seriously. "That won't happen again." Sophie blinked, looked at her father again, then back at Clara. "There's blueberries in those?" she asked, nodding toward the plate Clara was assembling, in the pancakes, folded in, not on top. "Some people don't like them getting soggy on top." A pause. "I don't like them soggy on top," Sophie said. "I know," Clara said, and set the plate on the table. Ethan stood in the doorway and watched his daughter sit down, pull out one earbud completely, and pick up a fork. He didn't say anything. He didn't trust his voice right then. The first week was about logistics. Clara learned the rhythms of the house the way a musician learns a new piece, not by reading the sheet music, but by listening. She noticed that Ethan left his coffee mug on the counter every morning, rather than putting it in the sink, not out of laziness, but because he always intended to come back for a second cup, and never did. She noticed that Sophie's lunch from school came home untouched on Tuesdays, which was the day they served something Sophie didn't like but wouldn't explain. She noticed that the two people who lived in this house moved through it in near-perfect avoidance of each other, not out of hatred, but out of a shared, unspoken grief neither one of them had the vocabulary to address. She didn't say any of this out loud. She just cooked. On Tuesday, she started packing Sophie a lunch. Sophie didn't mention it, but the lunch came home empty. On Wednesday morning, Ethan found a plate of eggs and toast on the counter next to his coffee maker, covered with a small lid to keep it warm. He stood there for a long moment, looking at it. Then he sat down and ate it standing at the counter. And for the first time in probably 8 months, he didn't go to work with a headache that he'd been quietly blaming on the weather. The afternoon of the 10th day, Clara was alone in the kitchen. She was working from the old cloth notebook, the one she'd carried under her arm the morning she arrived. The one that was soft at the corners from years of handling, with a faded floral cover and pages that had started to yellow at the edges. She had it open on the counter, following a recipe the way other people follow a road they've driven. So many times, they don't need to look at the signs. She was making pie. Apple. Old-fashioned, nothing fancy. The kind with a double crust that took patience and cold butter and time. And that smelled, while it baked, like every good thing that had ever happened in a house. She'd made it hundreds of times. She made it the way her grandmother had taught her, with cinnamon, with nutmeg, with lemon zest, and with a small specific addition that most recipes didn't include: dried rosemary. Just a whisper of it. Her grandmother had called it the secret that makes people stop what they're doing and walk toward the kitchen. She hadn't thought twice about it. It was just a pie. It was just Tuesday. She didn't hear Ethan come home. He came through the back door at 5:20, earlier than usual, loosening his tie before he'd even fully stepped inside, already formulating the list of things he needed to do before dinner, before the call at 7, before he stopped. The smell hit him like a physical thing. Cinnamon. Baked apple. The particular warmth of a double-crust pie just past its peak heat, settling into itself, and underneath it faint, specific, impossible rosemary. His hand was still on the door. He stood there, and something happened to his face that he would not have been able to describe if someone had asked him. His features, which had been set in the composed, controlled arrangement he'd spent years perfecting, simply fell. Like a wall that had been holding back water, finally deciding it was too tired. He didn't move toward the kitchen. He didn't call out. He stood at the back door for a moment that felt much longer than it was, and somewhere inside his chest, in a place he'd sealed shut after the funeral, and told himself he'd deal with later, something shifted. He walked toward the kitchen. Clara was pulling the pie from the oven when she heard him in the hallway. "Something smells good," he said from the doorway. His voice was different. She noticed it immediately. Flatter than usual. Too careful. She set the pie on the cooling rack and turned around. And she saw his face. She'd worked for a lot of families. She'd learned to read a room in 30 seconds and a person in 60. She knew the difference between a man having a bad day and a man having a moment where his whole carefully built composure was standing on glass. Ethan Carter was standing on glass. "It's just apple pie," she said, keeping her voice easy. "Nothing special. I had apples that needed using." He walked into the kitchen slowly. The way people approach things they aren't sure about. He stood on the other side of the island from her, looking at the pie. "It smells like," he started. He stopped. He put his hand flat on the counter. "Mr. Carter," she said. He looked up. "This pie," he said. His voice had gone quiet in a way that was completely different from his usual quiet, which was controlled and deliberate. This was the quiet of someone who'd been caught off guard by something they didn't have defenses ready for. "Who taught you this recipe?" Clara set down the dish towel. "My grandmother," she said. "Margaret. She passed about 12 years ago. She had a whole notebook full of recipes, that one." She nodded at the old cloth book on the counter. "She made that pie for every occasion she could think of. Happy ones, sad ones, everything in between." She said it was the recipe that Clara paused. She said it was the one that made people tell the truth. Ethan stared at the pie. "The rosemary," he said. Clara went very still. "Most people don't notice the rosemary," she said carefully. "My wife did." He said it so quietly, she almost didn't hear it. "She made this pie. This exact pie. She said she learned it from someone years ago, before I met her, and she never told me who. She just made it. And she said the rosemary was the secret." The kitchen was completely silent. Clara looked at the notebook on the counter. She looked at him. "What was your wife's name?" she asked. He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd walked in. "Sarah," he said. "Sarah Carter. Before that, Sarah Whitmore." The color left Clara's face. She reached for the notebook. She opened it to a page near the back. A page with older handwriting than the rest. A different hand entirely. Neater. Careful loops and deliberate letters. And she turned it around and set it on the counter in front of him. At the top of the page, in handwriting he hadn't seen in 4 years and would have recognized in the dark. "From Sarah for Margaret, with love. Keep the rosemary. Keep the recipe. Keep the people who matter." Ethan Carter did not cry easily. He had not cried at the funeral. He had stood at the graveside, with his jaw set and his hand on Sophie's shoulder. And he had kept it together because Sophie needed him to keep it together. And he had told himself he would fall apart later, in private when it was safe, and later had never come, and safe had never arrived. And 4 years had gone by with the grief sitting in his chest, like a stone he'd learned to breathe around. He looked at his wife's handwriting on the page of a stranger's recipe book, and something in him broke open. He didn't make a sound. He didn't cover his face. He just stood at the kitchen island with both hands pressed flat on the counter and his eyes closed. And his shoulders, the shoulders he'd been holding rigid for 4 years, dropped. Clara didn't say anything. She didn't move toward him or away from him. She just stood in her kitchen, his kitchen, but it had become hers somewhere in the last 10 days, and let the silence be what it needed to be. After a long moment, he looked up. His voice, when he found it, was rough. "How?" he said. "How did your grandmother know Sarah?" Clara's hands were still on the notebook. "I don't know," she said honestly. "She knew a lot of people. She made a lot of connections that I never knew about until long after she was gone." She paused. "I knew she had a friend called Sarah, years ago, before I was old enough to really remember. She talked about her sometimes. She said Sarah was the kind of person who gave gifts without realizing they were giving them." Ethan looked at the page again. "Keep the rosemary. Keep the recipe. Keep the people who matter. She always said that," he said. His voice cracked on the last word, and he didn't try to recover it. "She used to tell me," she'd say, "Ethan, pay attention. Pay attention to the small things. The big things take care of themselves. It's the small things that disappear when you're not looking." The pie cooled between them on the counter. Outside, the October wind moved through the trees. Upstairs, somewhere, Sophie's music played faintly through the floor. "I'm sorry," Ethan said suddenly, "for the way I was when you arrived. I wasn't kind." "You were a man running on empty, trying to make sure nothing showed," Clara said, simply and without accusation. "I've worked for a lot of people. I know what that looks like." He looked at her. "Who taught you to do that?" he asked. "To just see people?" She almost smiled, not quite. "My grandmother," she said again. He nodded slowly, like something was settling into place. "The pie's going to be cold," Clara said, after a moment. "Is it good cold?" "It's better cold, actually. The flavor's set." He looked at the old notebook at his wife's handwriting one more time. Then he pulled out the stool across from where Clara was standing, and he sat down and he said, "Tell me about your grandmother." And in the kitchen where nobody had cooked a real meal in 4 years, in the room where grief had made itself at home and warmth had forgotten its way back, Clara Bennett opened the notebook, and she began. The pie sat between them, cooling outside. The porch light finally switched off as the morning caught up with itself, and Ethan Carter, who had forgotten what it felt like to be in a room with someone who actually saw him, sat at his own kitchen counter and listened, really listened for the first time in years. He didn't know yet what was beginning. He only knew that something frozen and long buried had cracked loose, the moment he smelled rosemary and apple and the ghost of his wife's laughter in a kitchen that had been silent far too long, and that, whatever came next, he wasn't sure he wanted to stop it. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay on his back in the dark, staring at the ceiling the way he had every night for 4 years. But tonight was different. Tonight the ceiling wasn't just a ceiling. It was a screen, and his brain was projecting everything onto it, whether he wanted it to or not. Sarah standing at the stove. Sarah in her old blue apron, the one with the faded yellow pocket. Sarah saying, "Ethan, stop working for 5 minutes and come taste this." And him saying, "In a minute," the way he always said "in a minute," right up until the minute stopped coming. He pressed his palms against his eyes. The smell of that pie was still in the house. He could feel it in the air, the way you feel humidity, not dramatically, just present, unavoidable, threading through every room. He got up at 2 a.m. and walked downstairs. The pie was on the counter, covered with a clean dishcloth, a small handwritten note beside it, in Clara's neat, practical handwriting. "It's better the second day, too. Don't skip breakfast." He stood there in the dark kitchen, reading that note for longer than made any sense. Then he cut a slice, ate it standing at the counter, the way he ate almost everything these days, and went back upstairs. He still didn't sleep, but the ceiling was quieter. By the time morning came, he'd made a decision. He needed to know more about the connection between Clara's grandmother and Sarah, not because it would change anything, not because he expected it to make him feel better. He needed it the way you need to find a missing piece of something broken, not because finding it fixes it, but because not knowing where it is makes everything worse. He came downstairs at 6:50, earlier than usual, and Clara was already in the kitchen. She was at the counter with her coffee and the old notebook open in front of her, not reading it exactly, just sitting with it. The way people sit with things they've carried for a long time. She looked up when she heard him. "You're early," she said. "I couldn't sleep," he said. He poured himself coffee and stood at the counter across from her. He nodded at the notebook. "Can I look at it again?" "Just the page from last night." Clara slid it across to him without hesitation. He turned to the page he'd been seeing on the ceiling all night. His wife's handwriting. The careful loops, the slight rightward lean she'd had since she was a girl. The way she always wrote her lowercase e, with a little extra curl at the top, like a question mark that changed its mind. "From Sarah for Margaret, with love. Keep the rosemary. Keep the recipe. Keep the people who matter. Tell me what you know," he said. "About Margaret. About how she knew Sarah." Clara wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "My grandmother grew up in Asheville. She moved around a lot when she was younger. She cooked for families. She did what I do. She had a gift for landing in places where people needed her without knowing they needed her." She paused. She mentioned Sarah not by last name. "I never knew the last name, maybe a handful of times when I was growing up." She said they met during what she called a hard season. She didn't explain more than that. She said Sarah was one of those people who makes you feel seen even when she's the one who needs help. Ethan set his coffee down. "That was her," he said quietly. "That was exactly her. My grandmother said she gave Sarah the recipe. The apple pie. She said Sarah learned it in one afternoon like she'd already known it her whole life." Clara's voice was steady, but careful. She said, when she left that family, whatever family she was working for, Sarah pressed the notebook into her hands and told her to keep it, to add to it. She said, "Margaret, this book should have 100 voices in it before you're done. Not just mine." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the early morning was gray and still. Upstairs, nothing moved yet. Sophie was still asleep. "She never told me any of that," he said finally. Not bitterly. Just honestly, she kept so many pieces of herself that I didn't know about until she was gone. I'd find things, a letter, a photo, and I'd think, who is this person? And how did I not know this part of her? He looked down at the notebook page. "It used to make me angry. Now I wonder what else is out there. What other pieces of her are sitting in someone else's house?" Clara looked at him across the counter. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Ethan," he said, "please." "Mr. Carter is what the bank calls me, Ethan." She said it once, carefully, like she was testing how it fit. "I don't think those pieces are lost. I think they're just distributed. She gave parts of herself to people, and those people are still carrying them. That's not loss. That's how some people choose to live." He looked at her directly. "Is that how your grandmother lived?" "Right up until the end," Clara said. "She died broke technically, in terms of money." She almost smiled. "But she'd fed about 400 people over the course of her life, and every single one of them remembered her by name. I figure that's a different kind of wealth." Ethan didn't answer right away. He just turned that over in his mind, the way you turn a stone over to see what's underneath. Then he heard Sophie on the stairs. He straightened up automatically, the way he always did, the shift from whatever he'd been feeling to the composed, functional version of himself he'd decided his daughter needed to see. It happened in about half a second, and he didn't even notice he was doing it anymore. It had become as automatic as breathing. Sophie came into the kitchen with her backpack already on, half her hair pinned back, the other half deciding for itself what it wanted to do. She stopped when she saw both of them standing at the counter, and something flickered across her face, quick, unreadable, the teenage version of an adult expression. "You're both up early," she said. "Your father couldn't sleep," Clara said easily, like this was ordinary. "There's oatmeal on the stove. Real oatmeal, not the packet kind. Brown sugar's already in it." Sophie dropped onto the kitchen stool and pulled the bowl toward her. "Why couldn't you sleep?" she asked her father, without looking up. "Work," Ethan said. Sophie glanced up at him. Just briefly, and for a fraction of a second, he saw it, the thing she never said out loud. The question she'd stopped asking maybe 2 years ago, because he always gave the same answer. "Yeah, Dad, it's always work." She went back to her oatmeal. Clara caught his eye over Sophie's head. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. He looked at his daughter and thought about a woman who had died, leaving pieces of herself in other people's kitchens. And how maybe he'd been so busy, being careful, that he'd forgotten to leave any pieces of himself anywhere at all. It wasn't work, he said. Sophie looked up. I found something last night, he said. Something that he stopped. Started again. Clara's grandmother knew your mom, years ago. Before I even met her. The kitchen went completely still. Sophie put her spoon down. She looked at Clara, then back at her father. The teenager expression was completely gone. What was underneath it was younger and older at the same time. What? She said. The recipe, Ethan said. The pie from last night. Your mom learned it from Clara's grandmother. She wrote a note in Clara's grandmother's cookbook. He paused. It's her handwriting, Soph. I'd know it anywhere. Sophie turned to Clara. Can I see it? Clara pushed the notebook across the counter without a word. Sophie looked at the page. She hadn't had enough years with her mother's handwriting to have it memorized the way Ethan did, but she'd held enough birthday cards, enough notes tucked into enough lunch boxes, before the lunch boxes stopped coming, that she knew the shape of it, the slight rightward lean, the little curl on the lowercase e. She pressed her fingers flat against the page, very gently, the way you'd touch something fragile. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, she had really nice handwriting. She did, Ethan said. His voice was rough again. Sophie took her hand off the page. She picked her spoon back up. She stared at her oatmeal for a few seconds. And then she said, in the very particular tone of a teenager who is feeling something enormous and has absolutely no intention of letting anyone see how enormous it is. The oatmeal's good, Clara. Thank you, Clara said. And that was the moment, not dramatic, not cinematic, not the kind of thing you'd put in a movie. That was the moment Ethan understood that something in his house had shifted in a way that wasn't going to shift back. He was terrified by it. He was grateful for it. He wasn't sure those two things could coexist. And then he decided they probably couldn't. He poured himself a second cup of coffee and stood in his kitchen with the old notebook, his daughter's bent head and the smell of oatmeal and something that was maybe possibly the earliest, most tentative beginning of being okay. Then his phone buzzed on the counter, and then it buzzed again, and then it rang. He looked at the screen. His business partner, Derek Walsh, calling at 7:00 a.m., which meant something had gone wrong before the business day had technically started, which was Derek's special talent. He answered it. What happened? Derek's voice was tense and clipped. Hargrove pulled out. Ethan set his coffee mug down. What do you mean? Pulled out. I mean, he called me at 6:30 this morning and said he's taking his investment to the Meridian project. He said he's been watching our numbers, and he doesn't think we're positioned right for the expansion. He said. Derek paused, and the pause was the kind that meant the next words were going to sting. He said, and I'm quoting, Carter's been distracted for years. I need someone whose head is fully in the game. The kitchen was quiet around him. Sophie was eating her oatmeal. Clara had turned back to the counter and was doing something at the stove, deliberately giving him the privacy of her back. I'll call him, Ethan said. Ethan, he's made up his mind. I've been watching this happen for months, and I kept telling myself, you Derek. Yeah. I'll call him. He hung up. He stood there with the phone in his hand. Sophie looked up. She read his face with the accuracy of a kid who'd been studying her father's expressions for years, trying to understand a language he mostly refused to speak. Do you have to go? She asked. Not yet, he said. Finish your oatmeal. She held his gaze for a second, that quick, layered teenage assessment, and then she went back to her bowl. He put the phone in his pocket. Clara, still facing the stove. Is it quietly? It could be, he said. Do you want to talk through it? No, he said. Then, after a beat, yes. Not right now, okay, she said. And that was all she said, and somehow that was exactly the right amount. He stood in his kitchen and understood with sudden and clarifying force that he had been running his business, his household, and his own grief simultaneously for 4 years, and at some point in that process he had made himself into a machine functional, reliable, effective, and machines did not sit at kitchen counters reading their dead wives' handwriting at 6 in the morning. Machines did not feel their shoulders drop. Machines did not need someone to say okay in exactly the right tone to feel like the floor was still there. He was not a machine. He had simply forgotten what he was. That realization sat in him like a coal hot, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore. He called Hargrove at 7:15 from his office. The call lasted 11 minutes and ended with Hargrove saying, in the tone of a man who has already decided, "I'll think about it, Ethan," which in investor language meant no but packaged for politeness. Ethan put the phone down on his desk and sat very still for a moment. Then he got up, went back to the kitchen, poured himself a third cup of coffee he definitely didn't need, and said to Clara, "Tell me more about your grandmother." She looked at him. "Right now?" she asked. "Right now," he said. And Clara sat down across from him with her own coffee and the old notebook between them, and she talked. She talked about Margaret Bennett, who had grown up poor in western North Carolina and had learned to cook out of necessity and turned it into something closer to artistry, who had worked for families across 3 states over 40 years and never once, not once, left a house without knowing the names of everyone who lived in it, down to the dog and the most difficult family member, who had a theory that you could tell everything about a family's health, emotional health, not physical by the state of their refrigerator. Not whether it was full, she'd clarified, but by whether the food in it was real, whether someone had actually stood at a stove and made something, or whether every container was a delivery order, a frozen meal, a placeholder for the act of nourishment without any of the intention behind it. She would have had something to say about your refrigerator 2 weeks ago, Clara said. Ethan almost laughed. Actually almost laughed, a sound that came up and caught in his chest before it fully cleared his throat. "I can imagine." She wasn't unkind about it, Clara said. She just had a theory. She called it the cold kitchen problem. She said that when a kitchen goes cold, when people stop actually cooking, stop gathering, stop using it for anything other than function, it means the family is in some kind of trouble. Not always obvious trouble. Sometimes very hidden trouble. But trouble. And what did she do about it? Ethan asked. She cooked, Clara said simply. She just cooked. And she waited. She said food was the oldest conversation humans had. That you didn't need words if you had a table and something real on it. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like she was remarkable," he said. "She was inconvenient," Clara said. "She had opinions about everything, and she was usually right, which made her even more inconvenient." This time she actually smiled, a real one. Quick and warm, there and gone like a match struck in a dark room. "She would have liked you, I think." She had a weakness for stubborn people who were smarter than they let on. He looked at her. "She thought you were stubborn?" She thought I was the most stubborn person she'd ever met. Clara paused. She meant it as a compliment. Most of the time. He leaned back in the stool, and something in the set of his shoulders was almost not relaxed. Not quite, but the earliest prototype of relaxed. Like a man who had forgotten what the direction of ease felt like, but was beginning to recall the general coordinates. "You don't seem stubborn to me." "Give it time," she said dryly. He really almost laughed again. It happened faster than the first time the sound came up and got further before his chest decided it wasn't safe yet. But it was closer. His phone buzzed again. He looked at it. Derek, he declined the call. Clara watched him do it. "The investor?" she asked. "My business partner," he said. "He wants to talk strategy. He thinks I need to." He paused. "He thinks I need to restructure my priorities. Focus on the business. Stop being distracted. What do you think?" He set the phone face down on the counter. "I think I've been focused on the business for 4 years, and it hasn't made anything better." Clara looked at him steadily. What would make things better? The question was so direct that it stopped him completely. Not because it was aggressive, it wasn't aggressive at all. It was the opposite. It was the kind of question that required you to actually have an answer. And the terrifying thing was that he hadn't asked himself that question in 4 years. He'd asked, what would make things functional? What would make things stable? What would make things survivable? But better as in something above the baseline. Something that felt like forward motion towards something, rather than just away from the worst of it. "I don't know," he said. And saying it out loud felt like setting something heavy down. "I genuinely don't know." Clara nodded. "That's as an honest answer. It's not a very reassuring one." "No," she agreed. "But honest is better than reassuring. In my experience, Reassuring is usually just the story we tell ourselves to avoid admitting we don't know. He looked at her for a long moment. How old are you? He asked. 46, she said. You talk like someone twice that. I've had a heavy few decades, she said. And there was something in the way she said it, a dryness, a practiced lightness over something that wasn't light at all, that made him understand for the first time Clara Bennett had her own weight that she was carrying. She wasn't just the capable, steady presence in his kitchen. She was a person with a history and a fullness to her life that he'd been too absorbed in his own to consider. What happened? He asked, carefully, like he understood it might be none of his business. She was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone deciding whether to answer, but the quiet of someone deciding how. My mother was sick for a long time, she said. Finally, I took care of her. And then she was gone. And I had been taking care of her for so long that when I looked around, I didn't quite know what my own life was supposed to look like. I'd put everything on hold, and then, when the hold ended, she turned her coffee cup slowly in her hands. The life I'd expected to have wasn't there anymore. So I started over. I was 38. And this is what you started over with, he said. Cooking for other people's families. I like it, she said. Firmly. Not defensively firmly. People look at what I do and they think it's less than. They think it means I didn't have better options, or I wasn't smart enough for something else. Or she stopped. I have a degree, actually. English literature. University of North Carolina. A pause. My mother used to joke that I spent 4 years getting a degree in how to read books and then used it to read people, which was basically the same skill. Ethan stared at her. You have a literature degree, he said. I know, she said. It surprises people. It doesn't surprise me, he said. Slowly. It explains a lot, actually. She raised an eyebrow. The way you observe things, he said. The way you pay attention to not what people say but what they mean. That's not cooking school. That's someone who's spent a lot of time with books that are about the space between what people say and what they mean. Now she was the one who looked slightly caught off guard, just for a moment. The shift was quick, a fraction of an expression, but he saw it. You're more observant than you let on, she said. I've had a heavy few decades, he said. And she looked at him. And he looked at her. And for a moment that had no agenda and no pretense and no careful management. Two people who had been carrying their separate weights in their separate silences simply recognized each other. Then Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway in her coat. Backpack on, ready for the bus. And the moment snapped back into ordinary time. I'm leaving, she said. Then she looked at Clara. That was really good oatmeal. Thank you, Clara said. Sophie looked at her father. He expected the usual, the brief, performative goodbye, the door, the sound of the bus a minute later. Instead, she crossed the kitchen, and without any warning, she put one arm around his waist from the side and pressed her face briefly against his shoulder, the way she'd done when she was 6. When the world was smaller, and he was the person who contained it. He put his arm around her. His hand was big on her shoulder blade. She stepped back almost immediately, pulling her composure back around her like a coat. Bye, she said. To both of them. And she was gone. The back door clicked shut. Ethan stood very still. His chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with anything wrong. It hurt the way things hurt when something that's been frozen begins. Slowly. To thaw the pain of return rather than departure. He put his hand flat on the counter. Same gesture as the night before. In the same kitchen. At a different crisis. She hasn't done that in about 2 years, he said. His voice was mostly steady. Mostly, I know, Clara said. He looked at her. How do you know? Because the first morning I was here, when I said good morning to her, she looked at me like someone who'd forgotten that people did that. Said good morning to each other. Just as a matter of course. Without needing something. She paused. Kids forget things when the house is very quiet for a very long time. They forget that warmth is a normal temperature. They start to think cold is just how things are. He was quiet for a long time. I failed her, he said. No, Clara said. The word was clear and unhesitating. You survived. And you kept her alive and safe and fed and in school. You kept everything running. You just couldn't also be warm while you were doing it. People can't always do both. She paused. You're not failing her. You're just thawing out. It takes time. The coal that had been sitting in his chest all morning shifted. He picked up his phone. looked at Derek's missed call. Then he put it back down. "I'm not calling him back today," he said. Clara raised an eyebrow. "Derek," he said. "I'm not calling him today. The Hargrove deal is done. And calling Derek back today means spending 3 hours talking about restructuring and positioning and strategy when he stopped. What I actually need is to figure out what better looks like. You asked me that. I don't have an answer yet, but I'm not going to find it on the phone with Derek." Clara looked at him carefully. "What are you going to do instead?" He looked at the notebook between them. "Tell me the rest of it," he said. "Everything your grandmother wrote in there. Every page. I want to know everything she knew about Sarah." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled the notebook toward her, opened it to the first page, and said, "Then we're going to need more coffee." He got up without being asked and poured them both a fresh cup. Outside, the October morning had gotten brighter without anyone noticing. Light was coming through the kitchen window at a new angle, falling across the old notebook, across Clara's hands, across the counter where the remnants of the morning still sat 2 coffee cups, a spoon, the empty oatmeal bowl that Sophie had left behind, and in that kitchen that had been silent for 4 years. 2 people sat with a dead woman's cookbook and a shared ghost between them. And, for the first time in longer than Ethan could accurately remember, being in the house did not feel like endurance. It felt like something else entirely. He hadn't named it yet. He wasn't sure it was ready to be named. But it was there. Undeniably, uncomfortably, inconveniently there. And he thought, for the first time in 4 years, that maybe inconvenient wasn't the worst thing a feeling could be. Maybe inconvenient meant it was real. Clara turned to the second page of the notebook, smoothed it with one hand and began to read. Clara read slowly at first, the way you read something that belongs to someone else with care, with the awareness that words written in private carry a different weight when spoken aloud. The notebook was not a diary. It was not a confession. It was a recipe book, technically. But Margaret Bennett had never believed that food and feeling were separate things. And so the margins of every page were filled with the kind of notes that had nothing to do with measurements and everything to do with the people the food was made for. Ethan sat across from her with his second cup of coffee and listened. The first pages were mostly practical. Recipes for biscuits, for cornbread, for a chicken stew that Margaret had apparently perfected over the course of 20 years and 3 different stoves. The margin notes were small at first. Things like, double the butter for the Hendersons, they like it rich, or no salt for the judge. His doctor said so, but he'll sneak it if you're not watching. Little portraits of people sketched in the shorthand of someone who paid close attention and wrote things down so she wouldn't forget. But somewhere around the 30th page, the notes changed. Clara paused. "What?" Ethan said. She turned the notebook around and pointed. In the margin beside a recipe for sweet potato casserole, in Margaret's handwriting, were 4 words that sat by themselves, with nothing around them. She carried it quietly. Ethan looked at it. "Who?" "I don't know," Clara said. "There's no name, but look." She turned the next page. And the next. The margin notes on the following 6 pages were different from the earlier ones. Still about food, but the food was connected to a person Margaret was clearly thinking about while she wrote. Someone who came in the afternoons, someone who sat at the kitchen table while Margaret cooked and talked, and sometimes didn't talk. Someone who was going through something that the notes circled around without naming directly. The way you circle around a fire to feel its heat without walking into it. Ethan turned the page himself. He read the margin note at the top. She says she's fine. She's not fine. Nobody who's fine sits at a kitchen table for 3 hours without noticing the time. His hand went still on the page. "That's her," he said. Clara looked at him. "That's Sarah," he said. "That's the way Margaret described her. That's exactly her." His jaw tightened briefly. "She used to do that at home. Sit in the kitchen for hours. I thought she just liked being in there. I didn't." He stopped. "I didn't ask enough questions." "Ethan, I'm fine," he said, in the exact tone that the margin note had just described. Clara gave him a look that said she noticed the irony and chose not to comment on it, which was its own kind of comment. She turned another page. And then she stopped. She stopped so completely and so suddenly that Ethan looked up from his coffee. "What?" he said. Clara's face had done something complicated. She was staring at the page. She set it flat on the counter and stepped back slightly, like she needed a little distance from what she was reading. "What is it?" Ethan said, and he turned the notebook around himself. The page was dated. Margaret had rarely dated her entries, but this one had a date at the top right corner, March 14th. No year. In the margin beside a recipe for apple pie, the apple pie. The one with the rosemary. Margaret had written a paragraph. Not a fragment. Not a note. A full paragraph in her careful handwriting. And it read, "Sarah brought rosemary from her garden today. Said she'd read that it sharpened memory, and she wanted to remember everything about this time. I didn't tell her that I use it because my mother used it, and her mother before her, and that it has nothing to do with memory and everything to do with the fact that it makes the whole house smell like something worth coming home to. I made the pie. She ate 2 slices and cried a little and said she wasn't sad. She was just full. I understood that. Sometimes full and sad feel identical, and you don't know which one you're carrying until it comes out. She's pregnant. She told me today. She's terrified, and she's glowing, and she keeps saying she doesn't know how to be a mother, and I told her that nobody does, and that the ones who think they do are usually wrong." She laughed. She has a wonderful laugh. I hope the baby gets her laugh. The kitchen was completely silent. Ethan read it twice. Then he put his hand over the page. Palm flat. The same way Sophie had touched Sarah's handwriting the morning before, like the paper was a door, and pressing on it, hard enough, might mean something. She was pregnant with Sophie, he said. His voice had gone to a place it couldn't come back from quickly. "Yes," Clara said. "She never told me she was scared," he said. She was so certain about everything. She always seemed certain. She was certain about the things that mattered, Clara said quietly. She was scared about the things she hadn't figured out yet. Those aren't the same thing. He lifted his hand from the page. "My daughter's laugh," he said. "Sophie, she is." He stopped. His throat worked. "She has the same laugh." "Exactly. I haven't heard it much lately, but when she does, it's identical. Right down to the." He stopped again. Clara didn't try to fill the silence. She'd learned in 10 days that Ethan Carter did not need his silences filled. He needed them respected. He pushed back from the counter and stood up. And for a moment, he just stood there in the middle of his kitchen, with his hands at his sides, not doing anything, just being inside of something enormous, and not trying to manage it for once. Then his phone buzzed. Not Derek this time, a different name. One that made his face go from open to closed in about 2 seconds flat. He looked at the screen for a long moment. "Who is it?" Clara asked, because she could read the change in him, like a weather shift. "My mother-in-law," he said. "Patricia Whitmore." He let it go to voicemail. Clara watched him. "Does she call often?" "She calls when she wants something," he said. He set the phone face down. "Or when she wants to remind me that I'm doing something wrong." "Is she difficult?" He looked at her with an expression that contained an entire relationship's worth of complicated history compressed into one look. "Patricia Whitmore," he said, "believes that her daughter deserved better than me. She has believed this since the wedding. She has never said it directly. She doesn't need to. She's very good at implication." Clara absorbed this. "What does she want?" "I'll find out eventually," he said. He sat back down. "She'll call again." He was right. 3 minutes later, the phone buzzed again. This time he picked it up, because with Patricia Whitmore, delayed conversations were never shorter conversations. "Patricia," he said. Clara was at the stove, not making a show of not listening, which meant she heard everything. Patricia Whitmore's voice came through the phone at a volume that suggested she had strong feelings about phone technology, specifically that it required volume to function. "Ethan, I've been trying to reach you. I was in a meeting," he said, "at 7:30 in the morning. It was an early meeting." A pause. "The kind that did work. I'm calling about Sophie. I'd like to have her for Thanksgiving this year. The whole week. Not just the day. I think it would be good for her. She needs to be around family." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened slightly. Clara, at the stove, kept her back carefully turned. "She has family," he said. "She lives with her family. Ethan." The way Patricia said his name was its own complete sentence. "We'll talk about Thanksgiving in November, Patricia. It's October. I'm planning ahead. You know how I am." "I do know how you are," he said. And his voice was steady, controlled, the voice of a man who had had this particular conversation approximately 40 times, and knew exactly how much ground he could hold, and how much he had to give to end it before it became something bigger. They negotiated for 4 minutes. Thanksgiving, not the whole week. 2 days. She'd come to him because Sophie couldn't miss school. Fine, they'd talk again. He hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand. Clara turned from the stove. She didn't say anything, but her eyes asked the question. She thinks Sophie needs more of her mother's family, he said. She's not wrong exactly. She means it in a way that implies I'm the problem. Are you? Clara asked. Direct but not unkind. He blinked. What, are you keeping Sophie away from them? Or is it more complicated than that? He was quiet for a moment. The question deserved a real answer, not a defensive one. He knew that. It's more complicated, he said. Patricia grieves by controlling things. She wants Sophie to be a certain way, to dress certain ways, say certain things. Remember Sarah the way Patricia needs her to be remembered. And Sophie, he exhaled. Sophie is not a project. She's a person. She pushes back. And then Patricia calls me and says I've raised her wrong. And what does Sophie say about all this? He almost laughed. Not the almost laugh from earlier that caught in his chest. This was darker, more tired. Sophie says Grandma Patricia makes her feel like she's doing grief incorrectly. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that's a very precise thing for a 14-year-old to say. She's a very precise 14-year-old. I know, Clara said. I've noticed. He looked at her. What else have you noticed? Clara turned fully from the stove and faced him. She thought for a moment, genuinely thought. Not performing consideration, but actually taking time with it, the way careful people do. She watches you, she said. She's always watching you. Not because she's worried about you, exactly, or not just that. She's trying to learn you. She's trying to figure out who you are when you're not in dad mode. Because she knows there's a person in there she hasn't fully met, and she wants to meet him. Ethan said nothing. She leaves you room, Clara continued. She backs off when you go quiet. She's learned that's what you need. But she does it at a cost to herself. She's been managing your feelings for a long time. Ethan, for a kid her age, that's a lot of weight. The silence after that was the kind that means someone has said the exact truth and the person hearing it needs a moment to decide whether they can tolerate it. He tolerated it. I know, he said. She needs to be a kid, Clara said. Not a caretaker, I know, he said again. You said it twice. Because I need to hear it twice. He pressed his hands flat on the counter. I've been telling myself that keeping things stable was the same as keeping things okay. That as long as she was safe and fed, and in school and her grades were decent, I was doing my job. I never let myself look at whether she was happy. Is she? Clara asked. I don't know, he said. And this time it didn't sound like relief. It sounded like what it was, the most frightening thing he'd admitted in years. Clara reached across the counter and put her hand, briefly, practically over his. 1 second, maybe 2. Just enough to say, I heard you. Then she pulled her hand back and went to the stove. Make her laugh today, she said. When she comes home. I don't care how. Tell her something ridiculous. Show her a stupid video. Ask her about something she actually cares about. And then actually listen. She stirred something on the stove. She just needs to see you trying. Kids don't need perfection. They need evidence that you're in there. He sat with that for a long moment. Then he looked at the notebook. Can we keep reading? He said. Yes, she said. But eat something first. You haven't had breakfast, and it's almost 8. She put a plate in front of him without further discussion. Eggs, wheat toast, sliced tomatoes, simple. He ate it without arguing, which she noted. They spent the next 2 hours reading through the notebook together. It was slow work, not because the handwriting was difficult, but because every few pages something snagged them, a margin note that opened into a longer conversation, a recipe that connected to something else, a detail about Sarah that Ethan hadn't known and needed a moment with before they could move on. Clara read, and Ethan listened, and sometimes they switched, him reading aloud while she listened. And in that way, they moved through 30 years of Margaret's careful record of the people she had cooked for and cared about, and observed from the patient vantage point of a woman who understood that kitchens were where people told the truth. At 9:47, Clara turned a page and went very still. Ethan looked up. He'd learned to read her stillness by now. What is it? She turned the notebook around. This page was different from the others. The recipe on it, a simple bread pudding, was almost beside the point, because the margin notes on this page covered every available inch of white space. Margaret had clearly run out of room and kept writing anyway, cramping her letters smaller to fit more in, the way people write when something needs to be said, and the paper refuses to cooperate. But that wasn't what had made Clara go still. What made her go still was the date at the top of the page, and the name underneath it. The date was in November, and underneath it, Margaret had written, "For Clara, if she ever finds this." Ethan looked at Clara. Her face had gone somewhere private and inward. She was staring at her own name, in her grandmother's handwriting, with the expression of someone who has been handed something they weren't ready to receive. "Clara," he said. "I didn't know this was here," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "I've read this notebook 100 times. I don't know how I missed this. It's at the back of the page," he said. "The margin. You'd have to be holding it at an angle." She reached out and turned the notebook toward her. She read, and as she read, the color in her face shifted through several things that weren't quite emotions, so much as they were the raw material from which emotions were made. Ethan waited. When she looked up, her eyes were bright in a way she was working to contain. "What does it say?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. She looked at the page again. Then she read aloud, her voice careful and deliberate. "For Clara, if she ever finds this, and she will, because she is stubborn enough to read every page of everything I ever gave her, even when she thinks she's already read it all. You always think you know more than you do, and you always end up knowing more than you expected. That's not a flaw. That's the thing I love most about you. I am leaving you this notebook because it is the truest thing I own. Not because it has good recipes, though it does, but because it has the people in it. Every family I ever worked for is in these pages. Every name I was trusted with. Every table I sat at the corner of, listening to people tell each other the things they couldn't say directly. I have kept these people faithfully, Clara. And now I'm keeping you faithfully by telling you. The place you end up will be the place that needs you most. You'll know it when you get there. It won't feel like an arrival. It'll feel like a recognition. Like you knew this room before you walked into it. Don't be afraid of the heavy ones. The people who've been carrying too much for too long. They're not broken. They're just tired. Feed them. Listen. Be patient. They'll remember how to be human again. They always do. I love you more than there are pages for." Clara's hands were flat on the counter. She did not cry. But it was the kind of not crying that requires effort. Ethan didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, "She knew." Clara looked up. "She knew you'd end up somewhere like this," he said. "She didn't know it would be here specifically. But she knew the shape of it." He paused. "She knew you'd land in a place where someone needed you without knowing it." Clara looked at him carefully. "I didn't come here because of the notebook," she said. "I didn't even know it connected to your family. The agency sent me. It was just a job." "I know," he said. "That's not what I mean." He thought about how to say what he meant. "I mean, Margaret had 40 years of watching how people and places find each other. And she trusted that if you carried that notebook long enough, you'd end up somewhere it mattered." She was right. He looked at the page. "She's been right about everything so far. It's getting a little unnerving." Clara let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Almost. It broke through the tight line of her composure just enough to change the temperature of the room. She would have liked that, she said. Being called unnerving. She would have taken that as a compliment. "It was," he said. They sat there for a moment, in the particular quiet of two people who have just shared something that changes the texture of everything that comes after it. Not dramatically, not with fanfare. But the change was there, irreversible, like a key turning in a lock that didn't need to be opened loudly to be opened. Then Ethan looked at the clock on the wall. 9:58 a.m. He had 3 calls scheduled before noon, a stack of emails he'd been ignoring, and Derek Walsh was probably composing an increasingly alarmed series of messages about the Hargrove situation. He looked at his phone. 7 unread texts from Derek. He looked at the notebook. He looked at Clara. "I have to go do work," he said. "Actual work." The kind I've been avoiding since 6 this morning. I know, she said. I don't want to, he said. She raised an eyebrow. That's new. What is? You saying what you actually want, instead of what you're going to do. He stood up, and the chair scraped back, and he picked up his phone and looked at Derek's texts, and his jaw did the tight thing it did when he was putting on the version of himself that handled things. But before he left the kitchen, he stopped. He looked back at Clara. That thing my mother-in-law said, he said. About Sophie needing family. He paused. She's not wrong about the need. She's just wrong about where it comes from. Clara looked at him steadily. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once. The way people nod when they're confirming something to themselves rather than to the room. And he walked out. Clara stood in the kitchen alone. She looked at the page her grandmother had written for her. She thought about the word recognition. The way Margaret had written it, not like something you find, but like something you already know. She thought about a cold kitchen getting warm. She thought about a man who had forgotten how to say what he wanted, remembering. She thought about a girl with her dead mother's laugh. She turned to the next page of the notebook, and what she saw there made her sit down slowly, because it was not a recipe, and it was not a margin note. It was a full page of writing in her grandmother's hand, and at the top of it was a name she hadn't expected. The name was Ethan. She stared at the page. Margaret had never met Ethan Carter. Clara was certain of this. The dates in the notebook were from years before Clara had ever come to this house, before anyone had any reason to know Ethan's name. And yet, she read the first line. If Sarah's husband is half the man she described, he will be the most frightening kind of person, the kind who is capable of great love and has convinced himself he isn't. Those are the most dangerous people to care about, and the most worth it. Clara sat very still for a very long time. Then she turned the page over, checking the back, checking the adjacent pages, making sure she wasn't misreading the context, making sure there wasn't another explanation for how Margaret Bennett, who had died 12 years ago and never set foot in this house, had written a page about a man she'd never met with the specificity of someone who knew him. There was no other explanation. Sarah had talked about him enough, in enough detail, with enough love and enough frustration and enough of the particular tenderness that comes from knowing someone completely, that Margaret had built a picture of him that held up 12 years later against the reality of Thinny of him sitting at her granddaughter's kitchen counter. Clara thought about a woman sitting at a kitchen table for 3 hours without noticing the time. She thought about what someone says in 3 hours, to someone patient enough to listen. She thought about a pie that smelled like rosemary and everything worth coming home to. And she understood, fully and finally, that she had not ended up in this house by accident. Not in the way that involved intention or design, but in the way that Margaret had always meant, the way that things find their shape when you carry them long enough and far enough and trust that the carrying means something. She closed the notebook. She pressed her hand flat on the cover. Outside, a car started in the driveway. Ethan heading somewhere. Work, probably. The business that was struggling. The partner who was calling. The investor who had walked. All of that machinery grinding on without stopping because it never stopped. And Ethan Carter was the person who kept it running because he had told himself for 4 years that keeping it running was the same as living. She opened the notebook again. She turned to a blank page. At the back, the first completely blank page, empty and waiting. She picked up her pen, and for the first time in 12 years, she added something to Margaret Bennett's notebook. Not a recipe, not a margin note, just a line, in her own handwriting, below the ghost of her grandmother's last word. I know this room. She was right. Upstairs, Ethan's office was quiet. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled coffee and apples, and something older and quieter and harder to name. And in a house that had been holding its breath for 4 years, something finally, slowly, without announcement or fanfare, exhaled. But that was before the phone call that changed everything. At 11:23 a.m., while Ethan was on a call with Derek trying to salvage what remained of the Hargrove situation, his cell phone lit up with a name that stopped his blood cold. He looked at the name on the screen. He said, "Derek, I have to call you back," and hung up before Derek could respond. He answered the other call. "This is Ethan Carter," he said. The voice on the other end was a man he hadn't spoken to in 3 years. A man named Gerald Whitmore, Patricia's brother, Sarah's uncle. A man who had, at the funeral, shaken Ethan's hand and looked at him with an expression Ethan hadn't known how to read, and had spent 3 years not thinking about. Ethan, Gerald said, I need to tell you something. I should have told you a long time ago. And I'm calling now because Patricia called me this morning, and some of what she said a pause. I can't let it go any further without you knowing the truth. Ethan sat down slowly in his office chair. What truth, he said. About why Sarah was in Asheville, Gerald said. The year before she met you. The year she spent working with that family. Another pause, longer and heavier than the first. She wasn't just visiting, Ethan. She was running from something. Something our family did to her. Something Patricia has never told you because she's spent the last 20 years pretending it didn't happen. The office was completely silent. Ethan held the phone against his ear and felt the floor shift under him in a way that had nothing to do with the physical floor. Tell me, he said, and Gerald Whitmore told him. Gerald Whitmore talked for 22 minutes. Ethan didn't say much. He asked 2 clarifying questions in the first 5 minutes, and then he went quiet and let Gerald talk. Because Gerald was the kind of man who had been holding something for a very long time, and the only way out was straight through. And interrupting him would have been like stopping someone midway through a confession and asking them to start over. What Gerald told him was this. When Sarah was 23 years old, she had been engaged to someone else, a man named Charles Fenn, who came from money and had Patricia Whitmore's complete and enthusiastic approval, which should have been the first warning sign but wasn't, because Patricia Whitmore's complete and enthusiastic approval was something Sarah had spent her whole life trying to earn. Charles Fenn was polished and well-connected and utterly, systematically cruel in the specific way that very controlled people are cruel, never loudly, never in public, always in the precise language of reasonableness. He told Sarah she was too emotional, too much, too soft for the real world. He said it gently, consistently, over 18 months, until Sarah had gone from the woman who laughed at everything and cooked pies for strangers and filled every room she walked into with the particular warmth of someone who genuinely liked people to a woman who apologized for things that weren't her fault and asked permission for things that were her own. Patricia had known. Not all of it. Gerald was careful to say that. Not the worst of it. But she had known that Charles made Sarah small, and she had decided that small was manageable, and manageable was preferable to the alternative, which was Sarah making a choice Patricia didn't approve of. Sarah had left Charles Fenn on a Tuesday in November. She had packed a single bag. Gerald described it as the same canvas bag she always carried, the green one with the broken clasp, and she had driven to Asheville because she had a friend there who said she could stay, and she had spent the next 8 months working, cooking, rebuilding the version of herself that Charles and 2 years of his particular brand of erosion had worn down. That was the year she met Margaret Bennett. That was the year she learned the apple pie recipe. That was the year she wrote in the notebook, "Keep the rosemary. Keep the recipe. Keep the people who matter." Gerald paused. Ethan could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. "She never told you any of this?" Gerald asked. "No," Ethan said. His voice was very flat and very quiet, the way it got when he was feeling something too large to let any of it into his tone. "She didn't want to bring it into your marriage. She said," Gerald's voice went rough, "she told me once that you were the first person who made her feel like herself, without her having to perform herself. She said she didn't want to look backward. She wanted to look at you." Ethan put his elbow on his desk and pressed his hand against his forehead. "What does Patricia want?" he said. "You said she called you. What did she say?" Gerald was quiet for a moment. "She wants to build a case." "A case for what?" "For demonstrating that Sophie would be better raised in a more stable environment." The words landed like a fist in a quiet room. Ethan sat up straight. "She wants to pursue custody." "She hasn't said custody. She said guardianship considerations." But Ethan, Gerald's voice tightened. "They mean the same thing. She's been talking to a lawyer. I found out this morning. That's why I called." Ethan stood up from his desk. He didn't pace. He stood in one place and went very still, in the way that some men do when what they want to do is move, but what the situation requires is control. "She can't," he said. "Sophie is my daughter. There is no legal argument she has records, Gerald said. Carefully. Or she claims to. Business difficulties. She's been monitoring your company's performance. She has statements from, I don't know who, exactly. She didn't give me names, people who, apparently are willing to say that you've been, and her word was, checked out, that your grief has made you an inconsistent presence in Sophie's life. I have been present every single day for 4 years, Ethan said. I know that. I have not missed one school event, one doctor's appointment, one Ethan. Gerald's voice was firm but not unkind. I'm on your side. I'm calling because I'm on your side. I need you to hear me, and not argue with me, because we're on the same side, and I need you to know what you're facing. Ethan stopped. He breathed in through his nose, out through his mouth. Tell me what I'm facing, he said. She has a version of the last 4 years where you've been emotionally absent, where the house has been functional but cold, where Sophie has been provided for materially, but not filled up. She's going to use the business struggles. She's going to use the fact that you recently hired household help, which she'll frame as evidence that you can't manage without it. Gerald paused. She's going to be very precise about it, Ethan. You know how she is. I know how she is, Ethan said. After the call ended, he sat in his office for 4 minutes. He counted them. 4 minutes to feel everything he was feeling, without letting it become something he acted on incorrectly. 4 minutes of his daughter's grandmother weaponizing his grief to take his daughter away from him. 4 minutes of understanding that the woman who had spent 4 years implying he wasn't enough had spent at least some of those 4 years building a file. At the end of the 4 minutes, he got up and went downstairs. Clara was in the kitchen. She looked up when she heard him, and whatever she saw in his face made her set down what she was holding immediately. What happened? She said. He told her. He told her quickly, without the emotional packaging, just the facts in the order they'd arrived. Gerald Charles Fenn, Asheville, Sarah's history, Patricia's plan, the word guardianship, the lawyer. He stood at the kitchen island and delivered it like a briefing, and when he was done, he put both hands flat on the counter and looked at her. Clara was quiet for a moment. Sit down, she said. I don't want to sit down, Ethan. Sit down. He sat down. She poured him a glass of water and set it in front of him. Not coffee. Water. He noticed the distinction. She was treating this as a clarity situation, not a comfort one. Okay, she said. Let's think through this. There's nothing to think through. She doesn't have a case. She has a narrative, Clara said. That's different from a case, but it's not nothing. You need to understand the difference. A case is what you prove in court. A narrative is what people believe before it gets there. She looked at him steadily. Has anyone from the school, or the doctor's office, or anywhere in Sophie's life, ever had reason to be concerned about Sophie's well-being? He looked at her sharply. I'm not accusing you, she said. I'm asking what Patricia can point to. He made himself think about it honestly. Sophie's grades dropped in the first year after Sarah died. They recovered. She had a therapist for 2 years. Sophie decided she was done. Not me. She's had the usual teenage things. She's been quieter than she used to be. He paused. She's had a hard few years, but not because I failed her. Then you have a counter-narrative, Clara said, which is stronger because it's true. She paused. Do you have a lawyer? Yes. Call him today. I will, before you do anything else, Clara. Before you do anything else, she repeated. He looked at her. She was looking back at him with the particular expression she had when she had absolutely no intention of backing down on something, which he had come to recognize in the past 2 weeks as one of the more reliable fixed points in his daily life. Fine, he said. Yes, before anything else. Good. She straightened up. And the thing about Patricia's narrative, the cold house, the distant father, the functional but empty home. You know why that one stings? He looked at her. He didn't answer. Because there's enough truth in it to get under your skin, she said. Not because you failed, Sophie, but because you know the house was cold. You know you were running on survival mode. And Patricia is betting that your own guilt will do half her work for her. She paused. Don't let it. He stared at her. How are you? He stopped. Started again. How are you so clear about this right now? Because it didn't happen to me, she said simply. That's what other people are for. To see what you can't see when you're standing in the middle of it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what would you do? If you were me right now, today, what would you do? Clara thought about it. Really thought. Not performing thoughtfulness, but actually running through it. The way she did everything carefully, without shortcuts. I'd call my lawyer, she said, first, right now. I'd put him on notice, and I'd make sure he knows what Patricia has, and what she's planning. Then she paused. Then I'd go pick up Sophie from school. He blinked. School isn't out until 3, I know. Go early. Sign her out. Take her somewhere. Not home, somewhere neutral. A diner. A park if it's not too cold. Somewhere that's just you and her. No house, no history, no weight. She held his gaze. Because, whatever Patricia is building, the strongest thing you have against it is your actual relationship with your actual daughter. Don't let it sit in a file. Put it in front of you and remind yourself what you're fighting for. Something moved across Ethan's face. Not weakness, something deeper than that. The thing underneath the 4 years of composure. The thing that had been there the whole time, waiting for someone to point directly at it and call it by its name. She's everything, he said. His voice was low. She's the only thing, Sarah, left that I can hold on to and talk to, and he stopped. I will burn every bridge I have built before I let Patricia Whitmore convince a judge that Sophie would be better off with someone else. I know, Clara said. Now call your lawyer. He called his lawyer at 12:15 p.m. The conversation was brisk, professional, and clarifying in the way that conversations with lawyers are when the lawyer is good and the situation is urgent. His lawyer, a man named Robert Aiken, who had handled Ethan's business contracts for 11 years, and personal matters for 4, listened without interrupting, and then said, in the tone of someone who has seen this particular playbook before, Patricia Whitmore has no standing without demonstrable neglect or endangerment. What she's describing is grief, not negligence. We're fine. But I want documented everything: school records, medical records, every interaction you've had with Sophie in the last 6 months if you can get it. Make me a file. How much time do I have? Ethan asked. She hasn't filed anything. Right now, this is Gerald's warning, which means we're ahead of it. Stay ahead of it. A pause. Are there any vulnerabilities you haven't told me about? Ethan thought about the business. About Hargrove. About Derek's texts. About the months when this business had struggled and he'd worked 80-hour weeks, and Sophie had eaten cereal for dinner 3 nights running because he forgot to stock the refrigerator properly. There are things she could frame as vulnerabilities, he said. Nothing that actually is. Framing is half the battle in family court, Robert said. Call me tomorrow. We'll go through it. He hung up. He sat at his desk for a moment, with the phone in his hand. Then he went back downstairs. Clara was making lunch. Moving efficiently around the kitchen, the way she did everything without waste, without performance. Each action connecting to the next, with the logic of someone who'd spent years learning how to do the most with what was in front of her. Well, she said. He said we're ahead of it, Ethan said. He said to stay ahead of it. Good. She didn't look up from what she was doing. Are you going to go get Sophie? Yes. She gets out at 3:10. If you leave at 2:40, you'll miss the line. I know when my daughter gets out of school, he said. Good, she said again. And then, without missing a beat, lunch is in 10 minutes. He sat at the island and let the ordinary rhythm of the kitchen settle around him. Because he was beginning to understand that ordinary was not the consolation prize he'd been treating it as. Ordinary was the thing that held you up when everything exceptional was falling apart. Ordinary was lunch at 12:30 and knowing what time school skirt and someone handing you a glass of water instead of coffee, because they could tell the difference between what you wanted and what you needed. He ate lunch. He didn't taste most of it. At 2:30, he got his coat. Clara was at the sink. She turned when she heard him. Ethan. He stopped. Sophie doesn't need to know about Patricia today, she said. She just needs an afternoon with her dad. Don't make it about the fight. Make it about her. He looked at her for a moment. I don't know how to just be, he said with her. Without an agenda. I always have an agenda. Even when I don't mean to. Then don't plan anything, Clara said. Get in the car, see what she wants, let her lead. She paused. She's been waiting for you to let her lead for a long time. He nodded once. He went out to the car. He got to the school at 2:42. He sat in the parking lot and watched other parents, mostly mothers, a few fathers, People with coffee cups at phones, and he thought about what Clara had said. She's been waiting for you to let her lead. When Sophie came out of the school at 3:12, she was walking with a friend, a tall girl with red hair who talked with her hands. Sophie was laughing at something. Full, unguarded, head slightly back laughing, and the sound of it hit Ethan through the windshield like a physical thing. Because Clara had been right. It was Sarah's laugh, identical, and God, it had been so long since he'd heard it, without something muffled at the edges. Sophie saw his car. The laugh faded, not into unhappiness but into surprise. She said something to her friend. The friend looked over, waved, walked away. Sophie came to the passenger window. He rolled it down. "What are you doing here?" she said. "I came to get you," he said. "I take the bus." "I know." She looked at him with the same layered teenager assessment she'd been giving him her whole life. "Is something wrong?" "No," he said. "I just wanted to see you." She stared at him. "Get in the car, Soph." She got in. They drove for a while without talking, which was fine, because Sophie was not a person who needed to fill silence, a trait she'd gotten from him, and that he was only now beginning to appreciate as a gift, rather than a barrier. "Where are we going?" she asked, when they'd been driving about 8 minutes. "I don't know," he said. "You pick." She looked at him sideways. "I pick?" Yeah, she thought about it. "There's a diner on Mercer. They have really good pie." He felt that word land in his chest, with the particular weight of a coincidence that wasn't entirely a coincidence. "Pie," he said. "Their apple pie is incredible," Sophie said. "Jess and I went there last month. They do this thing with rosemary in it, which sounds wrong, but it's—" She stopped. He could feel her stopping. "It's like the pie Clara made," Sophie said quietly. "Yeah," he said. "I think it might be." They went to the diner on Mercer. They sat in a corner booth, and Sophie ordered the apple pie, and Ethan ordered coffee, and then changed his order to apple pie also, and when it came, he ate it slowly and thought about his wife, standing in a kitchen in Asheville, 23 years old, and rebuilding herself from scratch, learning a recipe that would travel across decades and land on his kitchen counter in the hands of a full-figured woman with a literature degree and her grandmother's eyes. "Dad," Sophie said. He looked up. "Are you okay?" she asked. Not in the careful, managed way she usually asked. In the raw, direct way that meant she was asking as a person, not as a daughter running damage assessment. "I'm getting there," he said. And it was the most honest answer he'd given to that question in 4 years. Sophie looked at him for a long moment. "Is it because of Clara?" she asked. He wasn't expecting the question. He absorbed it. "What do you mean?" he said. "I mean, before she came, you were like Sophie," pressed her lips together, choosing her words with the care of someone who has been waiting to say something and is not sure it will land right. "You were like someone who'd turned the heat off. In the whole house. Not mean. Just off. And lately you're like..." She paused. "It's different. I don't know. You actually came and got me from school today. I've picked you up from school before," he said. "Not like this," she said. "Not just because you wanted to." He looked at his daughter across the diner table and felt the specific ache of a parent who realizes that their child has been watching them more closely and more accurately than they realized. That children are always the most honest mirrors you will ever live with, and that he had been standing in front of this particular mirror for 14 years, and only now really looking. "She's good for us," Sophie said. Simply. Like stating the weather. "Yes," he said, "she is." "Are you going to mess it up?" Sophie asked. He blinked. "I'm sorry? Are you going to mess it up?" Sophie repeated. No particular edge to it. The question of a person who has watched their father's pattern long enough to be asking from data rather than malice. Because you do that. You find something good, and then you put distance on it. Like you're afraid if you get close it'll leave. Like Mom. The table between them went completely quiet. He looked at his daughter, 14 years old, wearing her mother's eyes and using her mother's vocabulary with a precision that Sarah would have recognized immediately, and he felt 4 years of carefully maintained distance crack open like ice in spring. Sudden and irreversible. "Yeah," he said. "I know I do that. Clara's not going anywhere unless you push her," Sophie said. "You don't know that. I know she's the first person who's been in our house in 4 years, who's here because of us and not because she felt sorry for us," Sophie said. "And I know you looked her up. I saw you on your laptop the other night." Her references and stuff. He stared at her. You looked her up before you even called the agency, didn't you? Sophie said. Because you read that letter from the guy in Charlotte. The one about her keeping him from falling apart. He said nothing. I found it in the recycling, Sophie said, unapologetically. I read it. I thought she poked at her pie. I thought finally, he's trying. The thing in Ethan's chest that had been cracking since the morning of the apple pie finished cracking at that exact moment. Not painfully. The way things crack when the pressure finally has somewhere to go. Your grandmother Patricia is trying to cause trouble, he said. He hadn't meant to say it here. Not today. Not like this. Clara had told him not to make it about the fight. But his daughter was sitting across from him, being more honest than she'd been in years, and he owed her the same. Sophie looked up sharply. What kind of trouble? She thinks she's been talking to a lawyer. She thinks she could make a case that you'd be better with her. He held her gaze. She's wrong. And I'm not going to let it happen. I want you to know that. But I want you to hear it from me, not from her. Sophie stared at him. She can't do that, Sophie said. She can try. She won't succeed. I'm not going to live with Grandma Patricia, Sophie said. And her voice was the voice of a person who is very clear on this point and is making sure the universe has received the message. I know, he said. She makes me feel like I'm doing grief wrong, Sophie said. I know that too, he said. Clara said you said that. Sophie blinked. Clara told you I said that? Is that a pause? Sophie considered. Yeah, she said. She looked at her pie. She's easy to talk to. She listens like she actually wants to know. Not like she's waiting for you to finish so she can tell you the right way to feel. Yeah, Ethan said. I've noticed that. Sophie looked at him. You like her, she said. And this time it wasn't a question, and it wasn't entirely about Clara's cooking. He held his daughter's gaze. She's a good person, he said. Carefully. Dad, Sophie said, I'm 14, I'm not 12. You can say it. He looked at her. He thought about a woman who had carried an old notebook across 3 states and knocked on his door at 6:47 in the morning. A full-figured woman with a literature degree and a grandmother who'd known his wife's laugh. A woman who handed him water instead of coffee when he needed clarity and who'd read his daughter correctly from the first morning and who had written I know this room in the margins of her grandmother's life's work. She's important, he said. To us. He paused. To me. Sophie nodded. Like this was the right answer, and had been the right answer for a while, and she'd just been waiting for him to arrive at it. Don't push distance on it, she said. I'm trying, he said. Try harder, she said. He looked at his 14-year-old daughter, telling him how to love someone, with a piece of apple pie between them and Sarah's laugh in her voice. And he thought that there were moments in parenting that humbled you so completely that you couldn't do anything but sit in them and accept them. Okay, he said. Good, she said, and ate her pie. They drove home at 5:15, and Sophie talked for most of the drive about school, about the red-haired friend whose name was Jess, about a history project she was working on, about how Jess thought history was boring, but Sophie thought it was basically just stories about people making terrible decisions, which Sophie found comforting because it meant she wasn't the only one who made them. Ethan listened. He actually listened, not as a parent monitoring for concerns, but as a person who found his daughter genuinely interesting and was only now, shamefully, fully acting on it. When they pulled into the driveway, the kitchen light was on. They could see it through the window, warm and steady, the particular yellow of a lit kitchen at dusk. Sophie looked at it. She's making dinner, Sophie said. Probably, Ethan said. Sophie got out of the car. Then she leaned back through the passenger window. Dad, she said, yeah, don't let Grandma Patricia win. I won't, he said. And don't let Clara go. He looked at his daughter. I'll do my best, he said. Do better than your best, she said. And she went inside. He sat in the driveway for a moment. He could see Sophie through the kitchen window. Now she'd gone straight to Clara, the way she'd started doing, and Clara had turned from the stove and said something. And Sophie was already talking with both hands. The way she talked, when she was telling a story she was actually excited about. He watched them. Clara said something. Sophie threw her head back and laughed Sarah's laugh, full and unguarded and filling the kitchen, and Clara laughed too, a laugh he hadn't heard from her before, lower and warmer and equally real. 2 women in his kitchen, one of them his daughter. The other a stranger who was becoming something he didn't have the right word for yet. His phone buzzed. Derek. The 7th time today he let it go to voicemail. Then he got out of the car and he went inside, and the kitchen smelled like garlic and rosemary and something just underneath both of them that was not a recipe and not a memory and not quite a name yet, but was real, undeniably real, in the way that only the most important things ever truly are. He walked through the door, and Clara turned from the stove, and she looked at him, and she said simply, the way she said everything, "You're just in time, dinner's in 20 minutes. Good, he said. And he meant it. What nobody in that kitchen knew yet, not Ethan, not Sophie, not Clara, was that Patricia Whitmore had already made her first move. Not legally, not yet. Something quieter and more immediate, and in some ways more dangerous than a lawyer's letter. She had called someone who worked for the local newspaper. And what that person had been asked to look into was not a story about grief or family or a struggling business. It was a story about a full-figured woman with a complicated financial history, living in a vulnerable man's house with access to his daughter. And that story was already being written. The article ran on a Thursday. It wasn't front page. It was page 4 of the local section. The kind of placement that said, "We're not leading with this, but we're not hiding it either," which was its own particular form of malice. The headline read, "Questions arise around hired help in Carter household amid business troubles." The byline belonged to a journalist named Donna Marsh, who had apparently spent 4 days making phone calls and had somehow assembled a story out of implications, unnamed sources, and the specific architecture of suggestion that doesn't technically lie but builds something false out of true materials. The article described Clara Bennett as a woman with a troubled financial background, which referred to the period after her mother's illness, when Clara had carried medical debt for 3 years before paying it off entirely. It described her as having limited formal credentials, which was technically accurate if you decided not to mention the University of North Carolina literature degree or the 11 years of impeccable references. It quoted an unnamed source close to the Carter family expressing concern about the nature of the relationship developing in the household and questioned whether a widowed father in the middle of a business restructuring is in a position to make sound judgments about the people he allowed access to his teenage daughter. Patricia Whitmore's fingerprints were on every single line. Ethan read it at 6:43 in the morning, standing at his kitchen counter, while the coffee brewed and the house was still quiet. He read it once fast and then again slowly. The second time, noting specifically everything that was technically true and everything that was technically true, in the way that a photograph taken from the wrong angle is technically accurate but fundamentally dishonest. Then he set his phone face down on the counter. He stood there for a moment. Clara came downstairs at 7:05, the way she always did, practical and unhurried, and she stopped when she saw his face. "What happened?" she said. He picked up his phone. He turned it over. He pulled up the article and slid the phone across the counter to her without saying anything. She read it. He watched her read it. He watched her face do the thing that faces do when someone reads something that is about them, the particular stillness that comes from having to receive something you didn't ask for and can't undo. She read it the whole way through. She didn't rush it. She didn't react in pieces. When she set the phone down, she was very quiet. "The debt was paid," she said. "First thing. Not defensively. Just factually, the way you'd correct a measurement." "I know," he said. "I paid every cent of it. It took 3 years. I worked 2 jobs for 18 months. She paused. "The degree is real. The references are real. Every word I said to you when I arrived was true." "Clara." His voice was steady. "I know." She looked at him. "You knew before you read the article?" she asked. "I looked into your background before I hired you," he said. "I told you I read the letter from the man in Charlotte. I read everything. The debt, the degree, all of it. I knew before you knocked on my door." She absorbed this. "Then why are you showing me this, like it's a problem?" she asked. "Because it is a problem," he said. "Not for me. But it's going to spread. And when Sophie gets to school today, someone's kid is going to have read it. Because in this town, people read the local section at breakfast and talk about it by 8. He held her gaze. "I need to know if you can handle that. And I need to know what you want to do." Clara looked at him for a long moment. What I want to do, she repeated. Yes. What I want to do, she said again, slowly, is make breakfast, and send Sophie to school, and do my job. She pulled her hair back the way she did when she was settling into something. What Patricia Whitmore wants is for me to pack my bag and disappear. She wants me rattled enough to leave, because if I leave, she wins the narrative. The hired help fled, which means there was something to flee from. She met his eyes directly. I'm not leaving. Something in Ethan's chest loosened. Good, he said. But you need to call Robert Aiken this morning, she said, before 9. Because what Patricia did by calling that journalist is an aggressive move, and your lawyer needs to know she's moved from threat to action. Already texted him, Ethan said. Clara nodded. She went to the stove. Sophie came downstairs at 7:08. She was in her school clothes, backpack on, earbuds in one ear. She came into the kitchen and immediately read the atmosphere the way teenagers read atmospheres, with the accuracy of people who've spent their whole lives in rooms where adults were feeling things they weren't discussing. She looked at her father. She looked at Clara. What? She said. Ethan looked at Clara. Clara nodded once, barely perceptibly. He pulled up the article and handed Sophie the phone. Sophie read it. The expression on her face moved through several things, rapidly confusion, then comprehension, then something that settled into a cold fury that looked startlingly like Ethan's own face when he was at his most controlled. She put the phone down. Grandma Patricia did this, she said. Not a question. We don't know for certain, Ethan said. Dad. Sophie's voice was the voice of a person who is done with plausible deniability. Gerald called you yesterday. Patricia's talking to lawyers. And now there's a newspaper article about Clara 2 days later. She looked at Clara directly. I'm sorry. This is my grandmother. This is my family doing this to you. Clara turned from the stove. Sophie, this is not on you. She's trying to make you look bad so she can say, Dad made a bad judgment call bringing you here, Sophie said. Her voice was shaking slightly. Not from weakness, but from the effort of containing something large. She's using you to get to him. I know, Clara said calmly. That's disgusting, Sophie said. It is, Clara agreed. Sophie looked at her father. What are we doing about it? And Ethan looked at his 14-year-old daughter asking, what are we doing? Not what are you doing? Not can you fix this? And he understood that sometime in the last few weeks, without announcing itself, the house had shifted from a man and his daughter living in parallel griffy to something that functioned, however tentatively, however newly, like a unit. We're handling it, he said, legally, correctly, without doing anything that gives Patricia more ammunition. He held her gaze. And you are going to school. Dad, Sophie firm. Go to school. If anyone says anything, you say nothing. If it gets difficult, you call me immediately. But you go. She looked at him. She looked at Clara. Clara said, eat your breakfast first. Sophie sat down. She ate. She didn't say much. But before she left, she came to Clara at the stove and put her hand briefly on Clara's arm, the same gesture she'd used on Ethan. Quick and warm, and there and gone, and said, don't let her win. I'm not planning on it, Clara said. Sophie nodded. She picked up her backpack. She went out the door, and this time she walked to the bus with her chin level and her shoulders set. And watching her through the window, Ethan thought that his daughter had more of Sarah in her than he'd ever given her credit for. Because Sarah had walked exactly that way out of a house in Asheville 20-some years ago with a single canvas bag and rebuilt herself from nothing, and Sophie didn't even know that story yet, and she was already carrying the posture. He called Robert Aiken at 8:41. Robert was not pleased. Not with Ethan, with the situation. His voice had the quality of a man recalibrating strategy in real time, which was exactly what Ethan needed him to be doing. This changes the timeline, Robert said. She's moved faster than I expected. The journalist angle is smart from perspective. She's building a public narrative before she files anything legally, which means by the time we're in front of a judge, there's already a story people have heard. What do we do? Ethan said. Counter-narrative, Robert said. And I don't mean a press release. I mean real documented, verifiable counter-narrative. I need everyone in Sophie's life who can speak to your parenting. Teachers, counselors, neighbors, anyone who has been a consistent presence. I need your financial record showing the business is being managed. not collapsing. And he paused. I need Clara Bennett's full employment history and documentation. Not because I doubt her. Because Patricia's lawyer is going to come after her. And I want to have everything already assembled before they ask for it. I'll get it to you, Ethan said. Ethan. Robert's voice shifted slightly. Is she important to you? Not as an employee, is she important? Ethan was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. Then protect her the same way you're protecting Sophie, Robert said. Because Patricia is going to go after the thing that matters most to you, and right now she's made a calculation about what that is. After the call, Ethan went back to the kitchen. Clara was washing dishes. The kind of focused, rhythmic task that people do when they need to keep their hands busy while their mind works through something. He sat down at the island. Robert wants your full employment history and documentation, he said. For the counter case. Clara turned off the water. She dried her hands. I have everything. References, tax records, employment contracts. I'll put it together today. You don't have to. He started. Ethan. She turned around. Stop trying to give me an exit. I'm not looking for one. He looked at Not, he said. And he meant it genuinely, not as a test, not as a challenge. As a real question from a man who genuinely did not understand why a woman who'd been publicly smeared by his mother-in-law and could walk away cleanly was choosing not to. Clara put both hands flat on the counter, opposite him. Her voice, when she spoke, was not soft and it was not hard. It was direct, the way everything about her was direct when she decided something mattered enough to say clearly. Because I have spent my entire adult life, she said, walking away from things that got hard. Not because I'm a coward. Because I was always in situations where hard meant genuinely dangerous or genuinely impossible. Where staying would have cost me more than I had. She held his gaze. This is not that. This is a frightened old woman making noise because she's losing control of a narrative she never had the right to control. This is manageable, and I'm not going to let someone run me out of the first place in years that has felt. She stopped. Like what, he said. She looked at him. Like somewhere I'm supposed to be, she said. The kitchen was completely quiet. Ethan looked at Clara Bennett, full-figured, steady, standing at his counter, with her hands flat on the surface, and her brown eyes direct, and her grandmother's notebook on the shelf behind her, and he thought about every moment in the last 3 sweet that had shifted something in him. The pie, the notebook, the morning with the coffee, Sophie's arm around his waist, the diner, the laugh, all of it accumulating into something he didn't have precise language for, but that was real in the way that only the most necessary things ever become real, not suddenly, not with drama, but with the slow, undeniable certainty of water finding its level. Clara, he said. Don't, she said, but not harshly. Don't say something you're not ready to stand behind. You've had a hard week, and Patricia is coming after you, and this is the wrong moment to say something, because the moment is emotional. I'm always in an emotional moment, he said. That's apparently my permanent condition. I've been told this by multiple people, including my 14-year-old. Something crossed Clara's face. Not quite a smile. The warm precursor to one. Then say it when you're not under siege, she said. I've been under siege for 4 years, he said. If I wait for the siege to lift, I'll be waiting until I die. She looked at him. I don't want you to leave, he said. Not because of what you do here. Because of what this house is with you in it. Because of what Sophie is. Because of what I am, he paused. I know that's not a declaration. I know it's too soon for whatever comes after something like this. I know there are 17 things currently on fire that I need to deal with first. But I need you to know that I'm not handling this because you're useful. I'm handling this because you matter to me. And I'm done pretending I haven't noticed. Clara was very still. Then she said, Margaret would have had something to say about this. What would she have said? He asked. She'd have said about time. A pause. And then she'd have told you to do the dishes. He almost laughed. The sound came all the way up this time, cleared his chest and his throat, and came out full and real. And Clara heard it, and her face opened into a real smile, not the quick, struck-match kind, but the full kind, the kind that reached her eyes. And it changed everything about the room. Outside, a car slowed on the street, then kept going. Patricia's move was not done. At 11:14 that morning, While Ethan was on a call with Robert Aiken and Clara was assembling her employment documentation at the kitchen table, the doorbell rang. Clara answered it. On the porch stood Patricia Whitmore. In person, Patricia was a trim woman in her late 60s, well dressed in the way that says money and habit, rather than vanity, with silver hair, kept precisely, and the posture of someone who had decided long ago that the world operated on her schedule. She looked at Clara the way certain people look at things they've decided in advance to find insufficient, not cruelly, but with a thorough and efficient dismissal that was almost worse than cruelty because it didn't leave room for argument. "I'd like to speak with Ethan," Patricia said. "He's on a call," Clara said. "I'll wait." She didn't wait to be invited in. She stepped inside, the way someone steps into a space they've decided belongs to their family rather than to the person who opens the door. Clara closed the door behind her and said, calmly, "I'll let him know you're here." She went to the bottom of the stairs and said Ethan's name, clearly and without urgency. She heard him say something on his call, then pause it. "Patricia's here," Clara said. A beat of silence from upstairs. "Tell her I'll be down in 5 minutes," he said. His voice was controlled, which meant he was feeling something he hadn't finished processing. Clara went back to the entryway. Patricia was standing in the hallway, looking at the house with the particular expression of someone conducting an inventory they fully intend to use later. Her eyes moved to the kitchen doorway, where Clara's documentation was spread on the table. They moved to the shelf with Margaret's notebook. They moved back to Clara. "You look comfortable here," Patricia said. "I work here," Clara said. Patricia's gaze was assessing and not warm. "I've heard a great deal about you." "I imagine you have," Clara said, "since you've been making calls about me for the past 2 weeks." Patricia's expression didn't change, which was itself a kind of answer. "I care about my granddaughter," Patricia said. "I know you do," Clara said. "That's not in question." "What is in question," Patricia said, "is whether the environment Sophie is being raised in is appropriate. A grieving widower, a struggling business, and a woman who appeared very recently from nowhere and has inserted herself into a vulnerable family." She said it pleasantly, the way someone says something they've rehearsed, for maximum impact with minimum blame. "I'm sure your intentions are good." "They are," Clara said. "But intentions aren't the same as outcomes." "No," Clara agreed. "They're not. Which is why I'd invite you to look at the actual outcomes." She kept her voice level. "Sophie's eating regularly, sleeping better, doing her homework. She laughed yesterday, full, unguarded laughing, for the first time in a while, by her own account. Ethan got in his car and drove to her school just because he wanted to see her. Not because anything was wrong. Just because he wanted to." She paused. "Those are outcomes. Real, specific, verifiable outcomes. That's what I'm building here. Not a position. Not an angle. A home that functions like one." Patricia looked at her. For a moment, just a moment, something moved across the older woman's face. Not concession. Not warmth. But something slightly less than total certainty. A hairline fracture in the absolute confidence of a woman who had decided the verdict before she knew the evidence. Then Ethan came downstairs. He came into the hallway, and he looked at Patricia and something passed between them that had years of history behind it, a long, freighted, accumulated look that contained an entire relationship's worth of things, said and unsaid. "Patricia," he said, "Ethan." She straightened slightly. "We need to talk." "We do," he said. "Come into the living room." He looked at Clara. She gave him a small nod, the nod of someone saying, "I'm fine." "Go." He held her gaze for one extra beat, the way he'd been doing lately without seeming to notice he was doing it, and then he followed Patricia into the living room and closed the door. Clara went back to the kitchen. She sat down at the table and looked at her documentation spread before her 11 years of her own life in neat, accurate, verifiable form, and she listened to the muffled sound of voices from the living room, unable to make out words, only the rhythm. Ethan's voice, measured and controlled. Patricia's voice, precise and pointed. A pause. Ethan's voice again, lower and longer. It went on for 31 minutes. When the living room door opened, Clara heard Patricia's voice say, clearly, "I'm doing this because I love her." And Ethan's voice said, equally clearly, "I know. But love isn't the same as right." The front door opened. Closed. Ethan came into the kitchen. He sat down at the table across from Clara. He looked like a man who had just completed something demanding and was not entirely sure what the result was. Well, Clara said. She's not dropping the lawyer, he said. Not yet. But she listened. More than she usually does. He paused. I told her about Asheville. About Charles Fenn. About what Gerald told me. Clara looked up sharply. She didn't know I knew, he said. That was clear. She went white. He pressed his hand flat on the table. I told her that the version of Sarah she's been protecting, the neat, appropriate, Patricia-approved version, wasn't the whole of who Sarah was, and that Sarah spent a year in Asheville, becoming someone she was proud of, and that the recipe notebook that's sitting on that shelf is a direct line from that year to this kitchen, and that if Patricia wants to honor Sarah's memory, she needs to understand that Sarah would have liked Clara. He paused. She would have. You know she would have. I know, Clara said. I told Patricia that too, he said. Specifically. How did she take it? Badly at first, he said, and then I don't know. She's a woman who has been carrying something for 20 years. The Charles Fenn thing. What she allowed to happen. I think she's been working so hard to be the keeper of Sarah's memory that she forgot to actually know who Sarah was. He exhaled. That's not an excuse. But it's something. It's something, Clara agreed. She wants to come for Thanksgiving, he said. She said it differently this time. Not as a demand, as a request. Clara looked at him carefully. What did you say? I said yes, he said. Because Sophie needs her grandmother. And because I am not Patricia. And I'm not going to handle grief by controlling access to people. He paused. And because Sarah wouldn't have wanted this. The fight. The lawyers. Any of it. Clara thought about a margin note in an old notebook. Keep the people who matter. You're a better person than she deserves right now, Clara said. I'm trying to be the person Sophie deserves, he said. That's all I've got. They sat at the table together, with the documentation between them and the notebook on the shelf, and the sound of the house around them, not the old silence. The held breath kind, but a different quiet, the kind a house makes when it's actually at rest. Then Clara's phone rang. She looked at it. A number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She answered, Is this Clara Bennett? A woman's voice. Professional, brisk, yes, Clara said. This is Donna Marsh. I wrote the article that ran this morning. Clara kept her voice neutral. I know who you are. I wanted to call you directly, Donna Marsh said. And something in her voice had shifted from the brisk professional to something with a little less certainty in it. I've received some additional information since the article ran. About the source who contacted me. About the accuracy of some of what I was told. A pause. I want to do a follow-up piece. If you're willing to speak with me. Clara looked at Ethan across the table. He was watching her. A follow-up piece about what? Clara said. About you, Donna Marsh said. Your actual background. The actual situation in the Carter household. I was given a specific version of events by a source with a specific agenda, and I should have done more before I ran it. I'd like to correct that, Clara thought for a moment. Who gave you the additional information? She asked. A pause. Gerald Whitmore, Donna Marsh said. Ethan, reading Clara's face, leaned forward. Gerald. Sarah's uncle. The man who had called Ethan with the truth about Charles Fenn. The man who was on the right side of this, and apparently had decided that being on the right side meant more than staying quiet. Give me a day, Clara said. I'll call you back. She hung up. She looked at Ethan. Gerald talked to the journalist, she said. Ethan sat back in his chair. He let that settle. A slow exhale. He's cleaning up what Patricia started. It won't undo the article, Clara said. No. But it changes the next chapter. He looked at her. Will you talk to her? I don't know yet, Clara said. I need to think about whether I want my life in the newspaper at all. Even the corrected version. That's fair, he said. What do you think? She asked. I think, he said carefully, that you've spent a long time letting other people tell the story of who you are, and that the one time someone told a version that was dishonest, it was public. And I think there might be something in having the honest version be public, too. He paused. But I'm not the one it's about. It's your story. It should be your call. She looked at him. You're getting better at that, she said. At what? Knowing when to have an opinion and when to give the space back, she said. He almost smiled. I had a good teacher. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Tell me something you haven't told anyone. He looked at her. The question surprised him. It was the kind of thing she did, sideways questions that came from nowhere and landed at the center of everything. Now, he said. Now, she said, he thought. He thought about what he actually hadn't said out loud. Not to Robert, not to Derek, not in any of the careful, managed conversations he'd been having all week. The first night you were here, he said. After the pie. After I read my wife's handwriting. I went upstairs, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time in 4 years, I didn't feel completely alone. He paused. Not because I'd processed anything. Not because anything was better. But because there was someone in the house who was actually here. Not here out of obligation. Not here out of pity. Just here. He looked at the table. I hadn't felt that since Sarah. Clara was quiet for a long time. Now you tell me one, he said. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at them. The morning I knocked on your door, she said. At 6:47. I almost didn't knock. I sat in my car for 11 minutes first. Because I'd read the notes from the agency, and I knew about the wife, and I knew about the other 4 people who hadn't worked out. And I thought, she stopped. I thought, this is going to be hard. And I almost convinced myself that I didn't have the energy for hard. That I should call the agency back and ask for a different placement. Something easier. What changed your mind, he said. The letter, she said. The one from Charlotte. The one you'd already read. The agency gave me a copy when they briefed me on the placement. She paused. It said she kept my house, yes. But more than that, she kept me from falling apart. I don't know how to thank her for that. And I thought she looked up. I thought that's the only kind of work worth doing. The kind that keeps someone from falling apart. She held his gaze. So I knocked. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the bus would be dropping Sophie off in about 20 minutes. The afternoon was getting the particular quality of late October light, coming through the window at an angle that made everything inside look warmer than the weather outside warranted. Clara, he said. She looked at him. I want to ask you something, he said. Not because of the article, or the lawyers, or any of what's been happening this week. Separately from all of that, she waited. Stay, he said. Not as an employee, as whatever this is, whatever we are. I know it doesn't have a clean name yet. I know there are 17 things still on fire. I know Patricia hasn't stopped, and the business is a work in progress, and Sophie is 14, and this is complicated in approximately all directions. He looked at her directly, without management, without the careful composure he'd spent years perfecting. But I would rather navigate all of that complicated with you in this house than navigate any version of simple without you. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about a woman who had sat at a kitchen table in Asheville for 3 hours and talked about a man she loved to a woman who listened. She thought about what Margaret had written. If Sarah's husband is half the man she described, he will be the most frightening kind of person. The kind who is capable of great love and has convinced himself he isn't. She thought about the line she'd written in the notebook. I know this room. She thought about 11 years of kitchens, each one a different family, each one a place she'd made warmer and then left. She thought about the word recognition. The way Margaret had meant it, not something you find, but something you already know. I'm not going anywhere, she said. And the way she said it wasn't accommodation. It wasn't gratitude. It was the simple, clear declaration of a woman who had decided, with full information and full intention, exactly where she stood. Ethan Carter, who had not believed for 4 years that his life could be anything other than managed, felt something in his chest settle into a place it had apparently been trying to reach for a very long time. He nodded once. Clara nodded back. And that was enough. For now, that was exactly enough. When Sophie came through the back door 23 minutes later, she found them both in the kitchen, Clara at the stove, Ethan at the counter, not doing anything in particular, just occupying the same space with the ease of people who have stopped needing to explain their presence to each other. Sophie dropped her backpack. She looked at both of them. She read the room in 3 seconds with the accuracy she'd inherited from a mother she remembered imperfectly and a father she was still learning. Okay, she said, like something had been answered that she hadn't quite known she was asking. She opened the refrigerator, found the leftover apple pie, cut herself a slice, and sat at the island. How was school? Ethan asked. Fine, she said. Somebody said something about the article. I said what you told me to say. Which was nothing, he said. Nothing, she confirmed. She looked at Clara. What's for dinner? Pot roast, Clara said. Perfect, Sophie said, and ate her pie. And in the kitchen where grief had lived for 4 years, like an uninvited tenant that everyone had learned to work around, something shifted into its final resting place, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet, irrevocable permanence of something that was always going to be true eventually, and had finally arrived at its own time. The old notebook sat on the shelf, Margaret's handwriting on every page, Sarah's handwriting on one, Clara's single line at the back, and the blank pages after it, waiting, not empty, ready. 3 weeks later, Donna Marsh's follow-up article ran in the same paper, page 1 of the local section, under the headline, The Real Story of the Carter Household. It was a straightforward, careful, fully sourced piece. It quoted Clara's actual credentials. It quoted 3 of her references by name, including the man from Charlotte who said on record, "She is the most genuinely kind person I have ever had in my home, and I would trust her with anything." It quoted Sophie's school counselor, who said the change in Sophie Carter over the past month had been notable and positive. It quoted Gerald Whitmore, who said that his niece Sarah had always believed that family was something you built with intention, not something you inherited by default. Patricia Whitmore did not speak to the press. She came for Thanksgiving as agreed. She sat at Ethan's table, which Clara had cooked for entirely, and she ate the apple pie. And at some point during the meal, she looked at Clara across the table, with an expression that was not warmth, but was the beginning of the consideration of warmth, which was more than Ethan had expected, and more than Clara had needed. It was enough. Robert Aiken called 2 days after Thanksgiving to say that Patricia had instructed her lawyer to stand down. No filing, no proceeding. He said it in the neutral tone of a lawyer reporting facts, but Ethan heard the relief underneath it, and felt it in his own chest like a key turning. Derek Walsh, for his part, found a new investor in January, a smaller firm, more aligned with what Ethan actually wanted to build, rather than what Hargrove had been trying to shape it into. Derek called to tell him, and, in the middle of the conversation said, slightly gruffly, as if it cost him something, "You seem different lately. Better." And Ethan said, "I am." And Derek said, "Good. Don't mess it up." And Ethan said, "I'm working on it." What Ethan Carter had believed for 4 years was that he was maintaining. That maintenance was the best available option. That a life run on discipline and competence and the careful suppression of anything that might require him to be vulnerable was a life that would hold. He had been wrong. Not about the discipline, not about the work, but about what a life was supposed to feel like from the inside. He had mistaken the absence of pain for the presence of living. And it had taken a full-figured woman with an old notebook and a rosemary apple pie and 11 years of other people's kitchens in her hands to show him the difference. Some mornings now, when the house was still early quiet and the coffee was brewing and Clara was moving around the kitchen, with her particular practical grace, he stood in the doorway and just looked. Not with the analytical eye he'd spent 4 years using on everything. Just with the eyes of a man who understood that he was looking at something real and present, and his, and that it was worth looking at. Some mornings Sophie appeared in the doorway beside him, and stood there too, and they watched Clara together in comfortable silence for a few seconds before the ordinary machinery of the day started up, before the backpack and the bus and the phone calls and the 100 small demands of a life fully lived. And some mornings Clara turned from the stove and caught them both standing there, and she said something like, "Are you two just going to watch, or are you going to eat?" And Sophie laughed, the full, unguarded laugh that was Sarah's laugh, and Ethan's favorite sound in the world. And the kitchen held it, the way it held everything now warmly, without condition, like a room that had remembered what it was for. On a Sunday in December, Ethan sat at the kitchen island, while Clara added a new recipe to the back of the old notebook, her own grandmother's bread pudding, written in her own handwriting, filling in one more blank page from the supply that had been waiting since Margaret died. He watched her write. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked. "When it's full." She didn't look up. "Give it to Sophie," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "She'll add to it," he said. "That's the point," Clara said. She looked up then, and she was smiling, the full kind, the one that reached her eyes. "That's always been the point. And Ethan Carter, cold no longer, home at last, understood that some stories don't end when the hardest part is over. They begin there, in the kitchen, with a pie that smells like rosemary, with a woman who knocked on the door and chose to stay, with a daughter who carries her mother's laugh like a gift she doesn't know she's giving. Some stories begin exactly where you thought you lost everything, and they are written, page by page, by the people brave enough to keep adding to them.